Thank, thanks, Chris, and hello, everyone. I'm calling in from Melbourne, a Wurundjeri country here for us. And yeah, Gene, I think everybody might have heard of him or seen him and experienced him. I've had the pleasure of having a couple of one-on-one conversations after I've seen him in every seminar I've been to, and I was always wondering where exactly does he live? I guess the time zones didn't seem to matter. Um, And I guess the first reading I've done on his work was on the systems thinking website that I think Jean you posted or coordinated as part of a bigger group. And I think it's still live. Like when I studied system dynamics, that was our sort of side Bible next to the sermon book. It's like for the more qualitative side of things and deeper thinking on, especially around the archetypes. I think that was my thing. Yeah, and many of you have heard him talk. He's done a lot of models. I think it goes into the hundreds of thousands, maybe. I don't know. Lots of videos. Um, and currently, there's a link. I'm pretty sure I can. I don't know, Jean, if you want to share that later, or I can share it. The Systems Wiki Musings is, I think, the link to parts of your brain of how it operates. Um, yeah, and Jean has been really active, I think, to support and develop and contribute to organizations like Kumu and the Insight Maker. I believe there's also a book that you co-authored. So yeah, lots to learn, and I think I've learned the importance of storytelling through a lot of your conversations, and it was a beautiful combination of having models together with story. I think it makes it really accessible. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more today. Yeah, over to you, Jean.
Well, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen.
Perfect, that's coming through.
So I should start by saying that I didn't come here to attempt to convince you of anything. I came here to share with you what I consider to be some of my most memorable aha moments over the last 5 decades that have got me to where I think I am. And the most difficult part has been trying to figure out how to include enough of them so that it hangs together to be meaningful, but not include so many of them that it becomes overwhelming and it seems like me and my dog named Arrow in the pointless forest. So we'll begin where I started. In 1975, um, an instructor in the computer science department said that for this course this semester, we're going to read Stafford Beer's Platform for Change. Not that I recommend it, okay? Some people have claimed that I've been in need of therapy ever since I read it. But for me, it was a lot like what people claim is taking a mind-altering drug. To say that I became an evangelist for the systems paradigm would be an understatement. To the effect where people would ask me what I did, and you could see their eyes glaze over as they were probably asking themselves, why did I ask and how do I get him to stop? Though I set out trying to develop some level of expertise in system dynamics. Of course, this was the time frame of IBM 360 in 1975, where you had to code all your instructions on punch cards and turn them into the deck to the computer operator who ran them overnight. And the next morning you got the deck back with a printout that said you got an error on card 57 in column 29, and you had to fix it and resubmit it again. So the whole process was only slightly more interesting than watching paint dry. It wasn't until 1991 when Stella became available for my Macintosh that I thought I had died and gone to heaven. And what happened was, all during this time, the most difficult thing for me was a blank piece of paper. Because, we've been taught through our entire lives that it's not good to make mistakes, and you always want to start and do the right thing. So I always wanted to start in the right place, but I didn't know where the right place was. So I couldn't start. So I ended up with a blank piece of paper, which was a vicious reinforcing loop, which turns out to get to be very depressing after a while. though I did in fact start, and I created a lot of models. And then I inflicted my models on other people, and inflicted is the right word, because I would develop these terrible, terrible PowerPoint presentations. The kind of PowerPoint presentation whereby if you set through the presentation by slide 10, you can't remember what was on slide 1, and you're asking yourself, why am I here? Can I leave? Do I have to sit through the rest of this? And I'm actually pleased that I didn't have to sit through my own presentations, because I knew they were terrible, but I didn't know what to do about it. So then in 1990, I read The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge. And then I read it in 91 and 92, 93, 94. And I thought I almost understood it. And I fell in love with archetypes, because archetypes, for me, allowed me to get a real sense of why things seem to evolve the way they did in so many situations. But then I forgot about them. And a couple of years later, I read Uncommon Sense, The Life and Thought of Ludwig von Bertalanffy, which was written back in the early 80s, 83, I think. And in it, seems as though back in the 1930s, he claimed that there were fundamental underlying structures which operated across all branches of science. And when I read that, I thought it was kind of ludicrous, until I thought about it for a while and said, well, the disciplines of science are a fabrication of man, not nature. And if we live in only one universe, why wouldn't there be a single set of structures that operated everywhere? And the thing was, he wrote this paper on general systems teaching, and it was meant to convey an understanding of how you could learn about structures and how they operated. And when you moved from one discipline to another, all you had to do was learn about the structures that were operating and the labels that were on them in that discipline. And all of a sudden, I realized that he's talking about Senge's archetypes. Though after years of getting stares when I tried to talk about archetypes, I actually changed the label and started talking about frequently recurring structures, which seems to be less objectionable to other people. Now, before the end of this, well, at the end of the presentation or someplace, I will post a link to this Kumu project, Kumu model. And if you go there and look at it, when you mouse over these things, and you'll notice that in some of them, there are blue links at the bottom. If you click on them, it will open another tab in the browser that will take you to another model that's a Kumu model or an Insight Maker model or something. So this is a one-page presentation of many pages, if that makes any sense. So falling in love with archetypes was fine, because I'm back to using them and finding them extremely meaningful. Though about that time, I run into Scott Fort Monroe, who's working on Insight Maker, which, for those of you who somebody's impinging upon my model, it's a web-based modeling and simulation environment specifically designed to do stock and flow simulation models. And I worked with Scott for almost 5 years, I think, testing everything he built and offering thoughts about other features that might be useful to users. And it's an amazing environment. It currently has about 500,000 users, and there are more than that number of models in the database. Some of them extremely good, and some of them very, very bad. Though, if you're thinking about creating a model about something, you might go and take a look. It's completely free. There's nothing that you can pay for. But after a couple of years, Scott said, well, maybe we ought to write a book. And what he conceived of was an interactive book where you, as you're reading through the book, after you read about some situation, you can click and actually interact with the model that depicts that particular topic or subject or situation, either a qualitative model or a stock and flow simulation model, right in the context of the book. Now, had to integrate a dozen pieces of software to get it to work. And it just got to be too much to maintain, but there's still a PDF version of it available. And the models are all in Insight Maker, and there are links to them so that you can still access them. Though it was a Kickstarter project, and we had over 400 sponsors for this project. And fortunately, there were a couple of dozen of them who read everything that we wrote. And one day, one of them said, "You keep talking about building models, but you keep writing all this text. When are you going to build some models?" Which, is kind of a depressing thing to get from your sponsors. Though, out of absolutely nowhere, the bird feeder dilemma problem popped up, which many of you have probably seen already, but I'll do it one more time. I'm sitting in the kitchen having a very pleasant breakfast, and my wife yells down from upstairs, "Are you finally going to clean up that unsightly growth around the bird feeder today? I'm getting tired of looking at it." And when that happens, this whole sequence of events flashes before my eyes as to how I got myself in this predicament. I deal with a lot of frustration on an ongoing basis, and a pleasant breakfast helps me deal with that frustration. And the birds outside on the railing have, for the past several days, have improved my pleasant breakfast, helping me deal with frustration. So after that happens, I say, well, why don't I install a bird feeder to increase birds at the feeder and the birds outside to improve my pleasant breakfast? And it actually works very well. It actually increases the attractiveness of the garden, which attracts more birds at the feeder, adds to my pleasant breakfast, and everything is delightful. Except, have you looked at the price of birdseed these days? So the need to buy birdseed adds to my frustration. And the birds at the feeder are creating spillage, which increases the need to buy birdseed, which adds to my frustration. And the bird feeder attracts the universal eating machine, squirrels, which decreases the birds at the feeder, increases the need to buy birdseed, increases spillage, need to buy more birdseed, and it's more frustration. And the spillage promotes the unsightly growth that my wife is complaining about. And the spillage is attracting rodents, and I have to figure out what to do about them. And the birds are now pooping all over the railing, and I have to clean that up. And it's a terrible problem, terrible situation. And I actually presented this model for years and didn't realize what it meant. So I'm going to come back to this model in a little while. And if I forget, somebody please remind me that I have to come back here, because there's a couple more slides here. So from there, as he was finally winding up Kumu, and he hasn't actually wound it up, because a year or so ago, he did a major refresh on the UI and added some new features, and it's amazing. But I connected, well, Fabian Zelensky sent me an email and said, you ought to go look at Kumu, because while Scott implemented a way to unfold a model in Insight Maker, it wasn't as fluid and flexible as I wanted it to be. And he was into doing system dynamics models, not storytelling and other kinds of things. So everybody knew I was looking, and I went to create a username and password for Kumu and found out I already had one. Seems as though 6 months or so earlier, I had looked at it and decided, well, it wasn't quite up to the task of what I was looking for, but they'd been working on it, and I connected with them, and I probably spent 3 years working with them, testing everything that they built and offering suggestions for new features. And I would estimate that I probably got 95% of what I wanted. So I actually love the environment. Though after I stopped working with them, the other 500,000 users asked for an endless array of features and functions, which they implemented also. And I probably only use 10% of Kumu at the moment. So the situation continues to evolve over time. And I'm always concerned, constantly reading about new stuff and other models and methods that claim to embrace the systems paradigm, and asking myself, why is it that we have so many models and methods when I'm perfectly content with system dynamics. And somebody points me to Michael C. Jackson's Systems Thinking Qualitative Holism for Managers. And in it, he presents this 2x3 matrix with systems on the left in terms of simple, something that you could envision designing and building, and complex, something that you might conceive of developing a level of understanding, but you couldn't design and build it. Across the top has to do with participants and the extent to which they're coherent, whether they're aligned in terms of goals, objectives, beliefs. So unitary, they're very well aligned. Pluralist, they're somewhat aligned, and they can come in agreement on things. And then coercive participants who can't agree on anything, and you can probably think of some of them. And in each one of these dimensions, there are some number of methods that have repeatedly proven to produce meaningful results in that context. And I've just listed a few of them here. And all of a sudden, I could understand a reason for having lots of different models and methods for about a day. And then I became terribly, terribly depressed because I've spent decades developing some level of expertise in system dynamics. And based upon this model, now I realize I have to learn a dozen different methods. And I said, self, you're not that smart. And, you know, how am I going to get out of this predicament? Well, thanks to my archetypes, the realization was that it doesn't matter what the method is. The intent is always the same. It's to understand relationships and their implications. There isn't anything else. They have different ways of going about it in different contexts, but the intent is to understand the relationships and implications to a point where you can interact with the environment in a way to move it forward. So where am I? I'm here. So I put together something I called the Foundation Trilogy, which is an independent growth structure, a reinforcing exponential growth structure, and a balancing goal-seeking structure, which are like I thought like the electron, neutron, and proton in the atoms, and all of the rest of the elements in the periodic table are composed of those three pieces. And every model that I have ever built is composed of some number of those three pieces. Of course, this one actually violates one of Newton's laws, but in some restrained context, you can envision this kind of a structure that has no feedback. So I'm delighted again. I've realized that everything that I have ever done was just about trying to understand relationships and their implications. Though the question was, how do I go about it? And I don't know why, is this red line showing up for you people too?
It does seem to be popping up occasionally. I'm not sure.
I believe it's
Okay.
VJ Alano. I don't know if you can, yeah, we can just see what you're doing on the screen. It's a bit.
That's okay. So different things connected at different times, but from back to my pathetic presentations and my work with Kumu and unfolding models and relationships and implications, I made this connection between a model and a play. If I go to the play and I sit there and I watch the relationships unfold between the actors from one act to another, and the play is done relatively well, when I leave and I take the story with me, because as Bateson said, it's the pattern that connects. And I said, oh, what I've actually done in inflicting my models on people over decades is akin to having the playwright walk up to a person who has not seen the play, hand them the script, and 5 minutes later ask them what they think. There is no way that that piece of work in that context can be understood. And it was that understanding that began to move me in the direction of becoming a storyteller. Though I asked one more question, which seemed a little strange, in that after all of these years of developing models and back here not knowing where to start, I actually asked myself, how do I create a model? And what fell out was very surprising to me, in that I begin with a situation or topic to understand. And I'll tell you in a moment why it doesn't say problem. I ask, what influences this, and what does this influence? And then I ask number 2 and 3 repeatedly for all elements until there are no more answers. Then I explain the model to someone else, asking them how to improve it. And then I try not to be an idiot and argue with their feedback. As Covey said in the 7 Habits, seek first to understand and then to be understood. And finally, to ask what the implications of the understanding we've developed. Now, with the advent of ChatGPT and Bard and Gemini and Claude and a whole bunch of other ones, I can short circuit step 5 to some extent, in that I can go and ask them about things that I'm clueless about, which is legion. And the reason that this doesn't say begin with the problem that you want to deal with, because Ackoff said it doesn't matter where you initially think the problem is. A thorough investigation will almost always surface the fact that the real problem is someplace else. What we tend to identify are symptoms, not the problem. And when we address the symptom, the reward is we get to address the symptom over and over and over and over again. So this was wonderful because it fell right into this understanding relationships and their implications, in that back to where I said I could start anywhere. And if I do a faithful investigation, I'll end up with some set of relationships that's meaningful, that helps me understand the situation. So here I get to go from the bird feeder dilemma to something to say, I really have to do storytelling. So I run off and I create this model called The Boy Who Cried Wolf, which is one of Aesop's fables. The townspeople give this boy the job of tending sheep. And if he sees a wolf, he's supposed to cry wolf, and the townspeople will come running and protect him. Though after some period of time, the boy becomes bored tending sheep and he wants attention. So what's he do? He cries wolf, and the townspeople come running, making him the center of attention, and we have a boredom relief loop. If he cries wolf and there is a wolf, that represents truth, which improves the beliefometer, which encourages the town people to come running, making the center of attention. So you have another balancing loop, which is an improved belief loop. Though if he cries wolf and there is no wolf, it's a lie. So it diminishes the beliefometer, diminishing the likelihood of the people come running, making the center of attention. So I have this simple 3-loop structure, which represents one of Aesop's fables. And I was so delighted with this, I had to send it to somebody and say, what do you think? And about 2 days later, they sent me back the story from the wolf's perspective. And I said, oh, there's the boy's perspective, the townspeople, the wolf, the sheep, the farmer, the land, and they're all valid perspectives. And if I don't figure out how to integrate them together, any intervention is simply nothing short of meddling, likely to make the situation worse. So I'm still into storytelling, but the realization of what does it mean is continuing to evolve and sort of weigh heavy in terms of, I don't know what it means. So I find this model, which is delightful for storytelling, that has to do with unwanted pregnancies, unwanted births, and sex education. And I liked it because it unfolded as a story so well, piece by piece by piece. And I could tell this story about the relationships and how they unfolded. And then I realized I'm doing the same thing I was doing with a PowerPoint presentation. By the time I get to loop 10, nobody can remember what was in loop 1. What's the sense of this? And I guess the real, Sengi said, one of our great learning disabilities is we become what we do. And I build models. Well, why? It's not a question of what I do, it's a question of what I enable. So if I labor over building these marvelous sets of relationships and nobody finds any meaning to them, I'm wasting my time. It's not a question of what I do, it's a question of what I enable. And I'm not enabling anything except more confusion and people wishing I would go away and stop bothering them. So the question is, how do I figure out what it means? And how do I communicate that in a way that makes sense? So I'm a real fan of books by the Heath brothers, who wrote Fix and Stitch and Switch and Upstream and a bunch of other ones. And the one called Moments, they said the best way to communicate a message to other people is to take a clear insight, compressed in time, delivered in a manner in which the audience discovers it. Because if the audience discovers it, they own it. I used to ask people, why don't people wash their rental cars? Now, I know lots of people that don't wash their own cars, but I've yet to meet anybody that washes their rental car. And I think it's a question of ownership. If I discover this, that's why all of these aha moments are so meaningful to me, is because they were discoveries on my part. They weren't something that somebody else gave to me. It was something that they sort of instigated along the way. So taking this, I went back to this storytelling and I said, what does it mean? Well, what it means is, well, and the difficulty here is, well, let me show you this part and I'll tell you what the difficulty is. If I have an unwanted pregnancy leading to unwanted births, I can take activity to diminish the unwantedness and I have a balancing loop. If I have an unwanted births, I can avoid the unwanted birth, which diminishes that, and I have another balancing loop. If I have an unwanted pregnancy, I can do unwanted pregnancy avoidance, which diminishes that, and I have another balancing loop. The difficulty is because we don't have an infinite amount of resources, time spent diminishing unwantedness diminishes effort available or resource available to focus on unwanted pregnancy avoidance. And therefore, I end up creating this vicious reinforcing loop that actually moves me in the direction that I don't want to go. And what I have is I have a shifting the burden structure. And here, if I focus on avoid unwanted births, it diminishes the efforts or resource available to focus on this. And I have another vicious reinforcing loop and another shifting the burden structure. And what I have is the entire model is two shifting the burden structures mushed together. And the aha moment for me was this relationship and this relationship are not in the other model. And to get these two relationships in the other model would add 25 more loops to it, making it impossible to understand. And I still haven't figured out how to put this in a form that actually does this so that I understand this. It's easy to describe and it's easy to understand, but I'm finding it next to impossible to figure out how to create. How do I unfold this story so that somebody listening to the story has an aha moment and said, oh. And then the other part is, some of what I like about Kumu is the way I do abstraction. Somebody says, well, isn't there a lot more to this? And I'll say, yeah, there's a lot more to it. And if you look at it, here are all of the pieces that actually go into that shifting the burden structure. Right? and you can, then that's for both of them. So the thing is, if I drop all the way back to we have a problem, guess what? Frustration, which was not addressed actually by any of the pieces of the model that I developed. I take all of these coping strategies to deal with, to sort of balance the frustration, but I never take any of the actions necessary to eliminate the source of the frustration, which means that I have a dependence on coping strategies, and I have another shifting the burden structure. Right? So I have come to believe, though I can't prove it, that any model that I develop, regardless of how complex or complicated it might be, is actually, the behavior of that model is actually driven by one or a small number of archetypes. The question is how to find them. And I don't know. Though, while I don't know, I am, well, and there's a reason that tomorrow looks a lot like the initial one, and that's because I feel like I'm at the beginning. And there are things coming that give me tremendous amounts of hope. Scott Fort Monroe is working on something called ChatGPT SD. If you describe a situation to it, it will give you all of the pieces for a stock and flow simulation model. It will identify the stocks, the flows, the variables, the connections, the formulas, and he intends to keep working on it until it just folds right into Insight Maker. And then I'm working with this programmer who there are times when I think he could be possibly an alien, in that he's developed this piece of software where if I give it a description like this, what is propelling the perpetuation of this historic conflict, and what are the blockers for a peaceful coexistence between Israel and Palestine? And I tell it that, and I'm not going to actually tell it to go run it because it'll take it a couple of minutes to do it. I'll just reload it. It gives me this causal loop diagram. And what's I find so amazing about this piece of software is it does not give me an Afghan strategy model every time I ask it a question. What it gives me is a minimalist perspective on what it thinks are the most relevant relationships. Now, not only does it give me the relationships, it actually gives me a description of every relationship in the model, along with approximate delay or time frame for that interaction. And it then allows me to go ahead and say, well, suppose I want to look at the external political pressure, and I want to expand the model, which I've already run. And if I load that, it goes ahead and expands around that. And I can think about this. And after developing several hundred models with this piece of software, which is still pre-beta, I have yet to find an element that I wanted to take out of the model. And developing an awareness that every model that I have ever developed is biased based on my own personal level of ignorance. Because I look at this and I say, I'd have never thought of that. Oh, I wouldn't have thought of that. And I can keep going, but not only that, if I ask you about, so here are all of the feedback loops that are part of it. If I go back to the whole model and come down here and say, it will write me a description of this entire model, along with, sometimes it will tell me about leverage points for the model, things that I can do to it, places that I can intervene. If I look at the feedback loops, it will write descriptions for the individual loops. If I actually get to a point where there are some archetypes. It will actually show me the archetypes that it knows about, and it will write me descriptions of the archetypes. Though it's marvelous, and this thing that I continue to evolve. I exported it and loaded it into Kumu, added all of the loop labels with all of the descriptions that came with it, and somebody asked me to present it, and I declined because I don't know what it means. Right? It's a marvelous wiring diagram. I can't present it in a way that I think is meaningful. It's just more confusion. So I'm working on it, and that's where I am at the moment. Questions, comments? Some people are still here.
Thanks, Gene. That was a great update on the work that you've been doing. Miriam, we haven't quite coordinated. Do you want to host the Q&A, or do you just let Gene loose with everybody in the room?
Yeah, whatever works. I guess direct interaction is preferable. So if anybody has a question, just maybe raise your hand and I can coordinate who's like, just in case we have like 20 at the same time. And
Great. There is a question in the chat from VJ as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Before you do that, Miriam, this what you're looking at is a Kumu presentation. Well, it's a Kumu project. If you go to the project itself, and I just posted a link to it, when you get there, it will most likely look like this. This is a video I recorded about the entire presentation. If you have questions later, you can send them to me at systemswiki.com. If you have a Kumu account, you can click on an element and simply click this icon down here, and you can actually start a discussion in the model, which will end up in my mailbox, and put a little red asterisk on the element. What's nice about that is that it saves the discussion back and forth in the context of the model itself to use to evolve the model. And as I said before, in certain instances, there are links that are about them. And if you click on some of them, there's actually notes in here that I wrote when I was thinking about what it was that I was going to say. So, all right, I'm done.
That's awesome. Thank you, Gene. I love the the commentary on your voice. It sounded all perfect, I reckon. Okay, so BJ Alano, you had a question. Do you want to unmute yourself, or do you want me? I give you a couple of seconds to see if you want to ask the question directly. Maybe not. So the question is, how more refined is the model compared to a mind map? What exact model probably is interesting? Do you refer to? Because I think we've seen a few.
It's okay.
Oh, you go, Gene, if you like start somewhere.
Well, when I think about mind maps start from a center point. Typically, the way I think about mind maps is they start from a center point and they branch outward, and it's like tree branches or tree roots continuing to, but they go usually sideways. And when I think about relationship models, it's elements and the relationships and their implications, so that it's not there typically isn't a center. It's just a bunch of pieces that are related that have implications. When I said about the way that I build a model, and I start with what is it that I'm trying to understand, I could start with a single word and say, what does it influence and what influences this? And I just continue to build outward. And the Akoff also said never improve a part unless it improves the whole. Though I always have trouble trying to figure out what the whole is, and uh, and you know, often I look at it as though the boundary is where I run out of relevance. If I don't have um, a coalesce of authority, power, and influence to actually address the situation, if it's outside of our collective span of control, then it's outside the boundary and there's nothing that we can do about it. And I think I'm way off of whatever the question was.
It's all right. We've got a couple of other questions in the chat. One is from David Williams. Do you want to go direct, David? You,
Yeah.
yeah, there we go.
Hi, Jean. Thanks for your talk so far. And I would say I'm a systems thinking novice, very curious and interested. Something that I got curious about was when you talked about building the model without a problem in mind. And I think you talked to it a little bit, but could you expand on that a little bit more? Because that got me super interested at that point for some reason. I'd like to hear what you've got to say about that.
Well, okay, I have dozens of situations where, okay, this small startup company is growing rapidly, and sales are multiplying month after month after month, but they begin to slow down and level off. So management begins to beat up on the sales force because they're not doing their job, because sales are declining and they should be growing. And why is this? And they get to a point where they're going to fire and replace salespeople because they're not doing their job. And somebody walks in and actually does a thorough investigation of the situation and finds out they're actually dealing with a growth and underinvestment problem. The problem is not sales. The problem is production. Customers are getting tired of waiting for their orders and they're going to buy stuff someplace else. So seldom do we know what the real problem is. We have a sense of a situation that we would like to address, though seldom is that situation actually the problem. It's usually a symptom. And in terms of the example that I just gave about this company, I mean, there are endless numbers of them because they're all growth and underinvestment problems. In other words, we wanted something to happen, and though we didn't actually invest to support having it happen, we didn't think about the implications of actually succeeding.
Mm.
So that when people look at the archetypes, let me go here. All right. Most people look at the archetypes from a negative perspective. If you got one, you know you don't want to have it because they're all bad. Though if you look at it with foresight and you say, I'm trying to fix a problem or I'm trying to promote growth, if things are moving in the direction that I want them to move, I can then go ahead and say, okay, if I'm trying to fix a problem, it's likely to evolve into a fix that overshoots the goal, or things oscillate endlessly, or progress slows over time, or fix creates a problem elsewhere, or things get better and then worse. So I have to go and look for these things before they happen and dissolve them. So the archetypes give me a sense of how to look ahead to say, okay, I'm trying to promote growth, but if growth is actually happening, does that lead to decline elsewhere, or does growth slow over time? Do I end up with limited resources shared by others, which is a tragedy of commons, and it constantly unfolds that way. So if you get to this project, which I'll post a link to this. Each one of these talks about the structure, gives a picture of it, talks about the thing about these frequently recurring structures is it's a well-defined structure with a characteristic pattern of behavior that has very well-defined strategies on how to deal with them. So for each one of them, you can click and there's a video that describes it, or a model done in Insight Maker, which will let you play with the structure itself and do the simulation and change parameters and those kinds of things if you want.
Chris, do you want to build on that? Just sorry, Paul, we'll get to you in a second.
Happy to go to Paul's question.
Okay. Yeah, just can I ask you, Jean, on just on that one, because it's, I guess what you're describing is more like the practice problem where they have a notion of a problem, but you don't drill into the sort of squeezing it into a structure of first problem definition and so on, but you sort of look at the problem from a bit of a distance. Is that what you just said?
Well, I think I would more say that you expand the context.
Yeah.
Okay. So that instead of, we end up with tunnel vision. No, how I say is, once we look at a situation and we think we know what the answer is, we stop thinking. Right.
Yeah.
Whereas if you think you know the answer, you're probably in trouble.
Yes.
And should expand the context to say, all right, let me move out and look at this from a broader perspective, and carry a set of habit cards in your back pocket so that you can look at them and remind yourself of the questions that you should always ask. All right. You can smile now, Tracy. I believe in them.
All right. Gets us to Paul's question. Paul, do you want to go direct or shall I read out your question?
I can go direct.
Sweet.
So, hi, Jean.
Hi.
So I was listening to, it seemed like the whole point of the presentation is to get to a place where we can understand what your current open questions are. And I think I heard 3 of them. One being how to talk to people such that they discover the insights themselves. That was one of them, right?
Okay. Yes.
And then another one was how to identify the archetypes in a story. And I've often called this the simplicity on the other side of complexity. It might not be a right way to say it, but wasn't that another question you had?
Yes.
And then a third one seemed to be how to learn from the ChatGPT systems thinking tool.
Yeah. In other words, Forrester said we learn best when we build our own models, and in several instances, people have looked at this and plugged something in, and something came out, and they said, "Oh, good, we'll go with that." Which is, you need to look at it with an enormous amount of critical thinking to say, does this make any sense, or am I just trying to make it easy? So I think that's a very good summary.
Yeah, I was just wondering, did I get it right? Are there other questions that you have at this point in your journey, or are those the main?
I think those are probably the main ones. What I said earlier on is there are probably 24 other aha moments that I left off of the map because it just becomes overwhelming and confusing. I've interjected some of them, though it becomes difficult to read these days because everything is, when you read the same paragraph 4 times, and every time you read it, you connect to something else somewhere that you read somewhere else. And so I find that it's just, I don't know, continuing to look and say, what is it that I'm trying to enable? Yeah. All right. So that, and the thing is, I can't change your mind. Only you can do that. The best thing I can possibly do is provoke thought. Because I came to, my parents used to call me why, and I finally came to the conclusion that people always, always, always do exactly what makes the most amount of sense to them in the context of the moment with their current understanding.
Yeah. You made the comment a minute ago about Forrester, and I have a comment on your comment. I think what you're trying to do, and I think what you've always been trying to do, is because I've been following you for decades, it seems. So it kind of is what you're trying to do. Kind of you use that word. The first step in the process that you had was something about a situation. So you didn't talk about, here's a dynamic problem that I want to learn about or understand, a particular dynamic problem. I think that's what Forrester did, was he focused, his number one would be, let's describe the problem that we have. And I added the word dynamic to it. And he has a process then for addressing that problem, pulling those elements out of the system, either individually or collectively as a group of people, that are relevant to a specific problem, because he never tried to model the system. He was always modeling the dynamics relevant to a particular problem. Whereas what you're doing is you're starting, and you talked about starting anywhere. I think Jay Forrester tended to start with that question no matter what it was. And so in one sense, he's thinking more narrowly than you are. And whereas you're starting with fuzziness of the situation, which and I think there's another question in the chat about problem versus system or something. So I just wanted to make that comment. I think you're working on how to help us address situations, not a specific problem.
Well, so, if I begin with a situation or topic I want to understand homelessness, okay? Homelessness is a symptom. It's not the problem. I mean, we only have one problem. That was the Big Bang a long time ago. To take homelessness and look at the relationships and continue to expand the context to figure out, it's another shifting the burden situation. It's easy to build shelters to get people off the street, but they're still homeless.
Mm-hmm.
The way that you get them to not be homeless is to figure out how to develop them to be self-sufficient so that they can sustain themselves, which takes longer, more resources. So it's another shifting the burden problem.
Yeah, and I think Forrester would say, by what you just did, by going from the word homelessness to how to avoid homelessness, that's in his, I think he would describe that as coming up with a better problem statement.
Usually when you ask better questions, you get better answers.
Yeah. So anyway, that was just
okay.
Next person.
Thanks. Thanks for that. We have another question from Chris. Chris, if you can add context to that, it would be good. The question is, are we trying to address a specific or well-defined effect, meaning trying to figure out a cause or the causes of something? Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this is just like the questions about the what problem we want to solve. Like I'm thinking, if we have for example, if we want to investigate something, we want to investigate it because there's something about it that affects us. So for example, if it's homelessness, then we try to figure out what are the causes instead of expanding to what the homelessness does. We go like move backwards. And then instead of trying to improve that system, what we do is like try to negate the causes. Like instead of trying to improve it, we just remove what is causing it. So something like that.
And which agrees with Akoff said you shouldn't solve problems, you should dissolve them. You should, and his comment about never improve a part unless it improves the whole. Of course, you have to listen to Elon Musk, who says the best part is no part, the best process is no process, which is consistent with what Akoff said. Though when he finally solves full self-driving, he'll probably have to say no car is the best car.
Yes, I agree. And also in line with that, when you said about how to like deliver like the model in a way that it will be the people your provoking thought you mentioned earlier. So like so maybe you should go with I was thinking like mention the effect that what it I mean how the people would those people spark their interest and then just a broad overview of it and then they will go in depth into the model once you have provoked their thought they will go more in depth into the whole model and then that's where they so you don't have to present the whole model itself, right? I mean, if you
Right.
present it in that the whole model, it's really difficult to explain. So I was just
And
thinking that
though in terms of back to what Forrester said about people learn best when they develop their own models, it's good not to develop models for other people, right? It's to enable people to develop their own models. Though I've wrestled with this endlessly, in that if you go to somebody and suggest to them that we have to build a model, and they don't know how to build a model, and they know they don't know how to build a model, they will find every imaginable excuse for why building a model is not the appropriate way to go, because they're afraid that they'll make a mistake and look bad. So you have to figure out a way to get them to build a model without knowing that they're building a model and never mention that they're building a model. And there's ways to go about that, but it's a little involved. So
yeah.
We have a couple of more questions. John was asking whether you could go over the archetypes again that related to trust in the conflict model.
trust in the conflict. Where was that in one of the archetypes itself, or was that no?
I think John, that was
No, I
the
was thinking of the
yeah, AI.
Israel-Palestine,
Yeah.
but not so much the specific conflict as the fact you had trust parked as a, well, I'm not sure it was your model, but there was trust in there and analyzing archetypes implicit in those dynamics seems extremely fruitful to me. And I just wondered how you think about that when you look at a problem like that Israel-Palestine
Oh, okay.
loops that you put up before. Sort of
Yeah, there was
what's your line of approach when you start to think about that from the point of view of archetypes?
okay. So if I'm going to interact with a person or a group of people around a particular situation, I will go build a model that they will never see. It's my homework. The model is a basis for me being able to ask better questions.
Yeah.
So that now that I have some of the AI resources available to investigate arenas that I typically know nothing about, I'm in a position to ask better questions. And if you're into one of these situations where you have a bunch of coercive stakeholders, it's a very touchy situation, because you can't tell them anything. They disagree with everything.
Yeah,
They don't agree with each other.
no.
Right? You have
That's
to
exactly the point.
right? So
Yeah.
you have to establish an environment that's relatively safe. once upon a time, I found myself responsible for a proposal development environment of 60 or 70 people, proposal editors, graphic artists, proposal writers, editors. And there were things going on in this department that were just terrible, but nobody would tell me. And I knew I needed to know. So I got 5 managers in a conference room one day, and I said, I would like you to do a SWOT analysis of me: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. There are 2 rules. I don't care whose comments. I will only ask questions for clarification. I'll be back in 30 minutes. Longest 30 minutes of my life. When I went back, they told me things that they never would have told me directly, because it was a safe environment. Though they didn't tell me a lot of things that they really wanted to tell me, because they thought I was full of shit. They didn't believe me. And I had to develop that level of belief over more than a year. And the thing was, they're talking to each other about me, which enables them to develop a better understanding of each other that they never could have gotten any other way. So we did this several times, and each time they got a little bit more realistic. And I posted their answers outside of my office on the wall, and I actually worked on them. And about a year into it, we did it in a skip level, so that it was them and my manager together doing it. And after the meeting, after my manager left and I walked in, and they said, and we thought you were the problem. So you have to invent environments to allow them to feel safe and discuss and develop a better understanding of each other. Because even trying to go to Boehm's dialogue is difficult, because they're not ready for that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I think we sort of have no pending questions. I hope I didn't overlook anyone. I have one built on the conversation you had before, and with Paul, and yeah, about this dynamic between the different approaches. And I'm curious, in all your life, in modeling, did you find there's like concrete differences between Forrester, who is an academic modeler, educator, building up an education stream and working on the back of, like, I guess, a university, versus someone in the field modeling, whether there's different approaches to how you go about modeling? Did you ever discover any of those? Or
I I think I quit paying attention to them.
okay.
Well, I just it was I didn't find that, or haven't yet found, that there was something missing that drove me to study the differences.
Mhm.
In other words, what once we get in the habit of doing something, which is the path of least resistance, we get comfortable with doing things in a certain way. Not that they're the best way, and we don't get jolted out of it until such time as we find that there's a shortcoming. Though somebody else can't tell us that there's a shortcoming, because we just become defensive. It's crazy. So in terms of this approach, I've been using this for several years now, and it seems to serve me well. And I'm willing to discuss it with anyone who wants to have a chat about it. I mean, item 7 came from Tracy, right? I think, unless I forgot.
Great, thank you.
I think it's really important to get to a place of sufficient self-reliance so that you can look at yourself and say, there is so much that I don't know. And just continue to be a sponge. though don't just accept. Try to figure out how to integrate things together. So it's not A or B, it's A and B, right? Because Charles Hamden Turner wrote a marvelous book called Charting the Corporate Mind. And he talks about the best answers show up when you figure out how to integrate A and B. And one of the examples is, once upon a time, American business believed that low cost and quality were mutually exclusive until the Japanese ate our lunch, proving that you could integrate the two together.
That's a good point. Tracy, you wanted to jump in?
Well, I was typing a question, then I wasn't being very articulate in chat. But so, Jean, I'm really wondering what has been like the biggest, widest door that would generate people's interest in the models that you've described. I know that you use Kumo quite a bit, and we've had a lot of discussions, but how can we generate more accessibility to and people's interest in being able to wonder about problems and systems and things that you've been talking about?
Well, I've come to the conclusion. Well, you remember the movie Fight Club?
Mm-hmm.
The first rule of systems thinking is don't talk about systems thinking. All right, which bothers some people, though. Unless I'm talking to people who have been drinking the Kool-Aid for a long time, I don't talk about systems thinking. I don't talk about modeling. All I talk about is how things relate and influence each other, and ask questions to provoke thought. And in terms of developing models, crayons work really well. Okay, I mean, it's just give people a big piece of paper and some crayons and say, well, what happens? The most enjoyable workshop I ever did was unexpected, in that I was invited to a conference to do a 4-hour workshop on systems thinking. And I forgot it was a workshop, and I prepared all of the stuff that I wanted to present, and even I wouldn't want to sit through that 4 hours. And at breakfast, I remembered that I was supposed to do a workshop. So while I'm finishing my coffee, I created a workshop. And I walked into this room of 35 people or so at 6 or 7 different tables. And I said, take out a pencil and piece of paper. On this piece of paper, someplace, draw a dot and label it cat. A couple of inches away from it, someplace, draw another dot and label it mouse. Now draw an arrow from cat to mouse and label it chases. You've now developed your first relationship model. If you feel faint, you should leave now. This group was absolutely out of control for 4 hours. But at the end of 4 hours, they were drawing very complex relationship models and telling stories to each other about situations that they were wrestling with. And we simply took that simple model and we expanded it. We went from the mouse to the mouse hole. The mouse runs to the mouse hole, and then the mouse hole frustrates the cat. All right, it completes the loop. And then we talked about how does a savings account work and how does a bathtub work, and we just progressed from there. And it was never a presentation of any real concepts of systems thinking and these things you have to learn. It was simply asking them questions that they already knew the answer to and piecing them together. I say the only person that I've ever met that 2 classes of people that I've met that don't employ systems thinking are either catatonic or dead, right? if you wake up in the morning and you're hungry, you get up, you take a shower, you get dressed, you go to the kitchen, you get something to eat, you eat, you're no longer hungry. You've just satisfied a goal-seeking structure. Now, people never think about it that way, though if you walk them through doing that, they connect very well with it because it's personal. So if you connect people with things that it's really easy to relate to, then you can move them sort of a little out of their comfort zone to things that they aren't quite so familiar with. But it's sort of baby steps.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Thanks, Tracy. Is there any other questions in the room? We've got a few minutes left.
I have more questions than answers.
Maybe you can give us some homework to think. Well,
so the question is to the group, does a presentation in this form hang together or is it confusing? Did I accomplish what I thought I was trying to set out to accomplish?
I'm not sure what you were setting out to accomplish, but I really enjoyed it, Gene. Hearing your life story there with systems, and also kind of getting a sense of where you are now. And then I think you did a great job of provoking discussion, conversation.
Okay.
Can I also jump in with an observation, Gene? I've got a lot of students who do like GIS modeling, the spatial modeling. And one of the things that's been one of the breakthroughs that's happened with some of the software that they've got is this ability to tell stories through like a web interface, but you're going through a geographical story and you can narrow down. And I think the advances in mapping technology has allowed that to happen. And I think watching you present your story in this way perhaps gets us to think about how we can encourage, like I'm in an academic environment, how we can encourage our students to tell a systems story that might include modeling, it might not include modeling, but in a language that makes sense for us. So for me, it was very useful to sort of see that play out.
Thank you.
Chris, I appreciate you saying the emphasis on story, because for me, presentation always seems like there's like a hierarchy to it versus a storytelling brings us to day-to-day, everyday dynamics of what goes on. And so I appreciate that.
In terms
Gene,
of
and you're a great storyteller,
question,
Gene. You're a great storyteller. So that's why I wanted to reinforce that.
Thank you. In terms of Andrew's question about how did I find time to do all of this? Well, it started, I had several years in college, which was a good beginning. And then I was in the military for 10 years, riding ships, and you can read and think about the stuff anywhere. And I don't sleep a lot, which many of you already know. I nap here and there, but I don't actually sleep much. And it's hard to sleep because there are so many fascinating things to think about. And not that I come up with answers, but it's just, I don't know. So you just go from one question to the next question to the next question, and then there are a few good things to read. There are a lot of not so good things to read because lots of good books that would be better as a 3 or 4 page paper, right? And if you want to use ChatGPT or Gemini or something, have it do book summaries for you, because I don't know, numerous times a week people say you got to read this, you got to read this. I don't know when I'll ever find time to read another book. First thing I'll do is I'll go to YouTube and find out if the author did an interview, and I'll find the shortest one I can possibly find. And a 4-minute interview gives me a sense of, do I want to know more, or am I wasting my time? And you just sort of work on it from there. And if it, I used to read a lot of books, but that was before the days of the internet. And now I watch a lot of videos and spend a lot of time interacting with Gemini. I probably ask it 50 questions a day.
I
haven't seen you in a long time. How you doing?
It's decades. Let's see, it feels like decades. Doing well. Just saw this presentation in the ISSS newsletter and wanted to see what you're up to. And one thing I get from this is you still have the same tone of, frustrating Zen master of people trying to pin you down, and you will, turn it around and, stand the question on its head and leave them to make their own discoveries. But there's also this interesting dynamic between tragedy, where there are no solutions, and there's only coming to terms with our with the fact that we solve, we swap one problem for another, and I think there's some wisdom. There's this Jean Bellinger's systems wisdom of recognizing that the archetypes are always going to be feeding into other archetypes. And so the worst thing maybe is hubris, because people in systems intervention world tend to be optimistic. And then being optimistic comes along with hubris and with the failure to recognize that tomorrow's problems come from today's solutions. Mm-hmm. So I think, maybe we should, you should aim for, Jean Bellinger's systems wisdom, give up, and in giving up, find peace and the ability to, manage as best as we can, or something like that. Anyway, I really appreciate the tone and the, I think obviously you cannot solve these things. We cannot solve all these things, but the insight into the process is itself a kind of solution.
So if we admit that there are no problems that we have that couldn't be solved by the elimination of all people, right? Is there something less drastic that we could agree on?
Right. Yeah, just watch out that AI doesn't. Well, they are going to discover that very quickly. That's the quickest way to solve all the problems that we pose. I think being wiser and more humble. That's Jean Bellinger's course in systems humility or something like that. Also, it evokes a little bit of the systematics, the sarcastic treatment of, each system, as soon as it's created, takes on a life of its own and will do whatever it wants, regardless of what you want to do with it, that kind of thing. I think we need more of that combination of humor and humility. And I think that is a way to get people to understand the way complex dynamics tend to unfold. I guess one thing I've wondered about is, of course, with the word archetype brings to mind Jungian archetypes and folklore archetypes and storytelling archetypes and things like that. And I've wondered if you have thought about looking into from a literary point of view, the modeling the archetypes, like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, But I know that in folklore, for example, there are people have done a lot of taxonomic work, identifying patterns that occur over and over again across cultures. And it would be interesting to see the combination of causal modeling, storytelling, representations of those.
So if you find some of those recurring stories that are not archetypes, I'd love to chat. Because because the sorry, the way I see the fundamental nature of these frequently recurring structures, even if you go to, well, I see them everywhere. When you talk about movie stories or book stories, or they're all there. Okay, they're not expressed in that form. They're not often they're not easy to see because they're dragged out over time. You know, I mean, it's maybe it takes 4 years for this balancing structure to actually complete, though it's in there someplace. And you know, you look at, I think about Armageddon. Armageddon, I think so. Where Independence Day. They show you little stories at the beginning, little vignettes, okay, about this interaction between a couple of people, and then an interaction between a couple more people. And it takes the rest of the movie to figure out how all those pieces connect. But they do. Right? Because, you know, I go back to what Bateson said, it's the pattern that connects. Because if the pattern didn't connect, there wouldn't be a story there that we could connect with and take with us. You know, this is Eric Jance's The Self-Organizing Universe. He talks about everything that we experience is someplace between complete confirmation of something that we already know and complete novelty that we can't connect with whatsoever. And somewhere on that arc between the two, there's a possibility for learning, because it extends our patterns of understanding. And I don't know where even I got there, but sorry.
Right.
My comment about it, just, I have no idea what I know until somebody cues something, and then stuff comes out, and you know, I don't.
On that note, Jean, I might call time, recognizing that we're at past and at the bottom of the clock. But there is open invitation to keep the room open if you wanted to keep the discussion open. But I know people might have to jump out, and we'll give them the social cues that allow them to do that. So thank you very much, Jean, for your time and your insights and sharing them with us. And we look forward to perhaps having an update at some point in the future about the work that and the open questions you're developing.
Okay. Well, if there are some more questions, I'm willing to answer them, or my day's just beginning.
Great. All right. Thank you, everybody. And we'll leave the room open if you wanted to stay and have a chat.
Thank
you, everyone.
Yeah, I think it would be a very interesting training method for you to take people through stories of the movie